A few years ago, I dated a girl whose grandfather was in bad health. Eventually, he could no longer care for himself, but his will to live was still strong. He was placed on hospice care several times, and each time that the family thought his end had come, he'd make a turn for the better and be taken off. Although he didn't talk much, when I met him, he could still hold a conversation. Over the years, that ability slowly faded away. Then one day, he stopped speaking altogether. Basically, from that point, Mr. Willie's best communication was a weak wave of his fingers or a faint smile. By the final time he was placed on hospice, he slept most of the day, and when he was awake, we could no longer tell if he recognized us, or if he even knew we were there to see him at all. Still, my girlfriend Val visited her grandfather every chance she had. Sometimes she would go straight to the hospice facility from her job, stay overnight, and then go home to change before she went back to work. One night while she was sleeping in the chair next to Mr. Willie's bed, Val heard a light knocking at his room door. When she answered, standing in the hallway was Mrs. Harding, another patient from down the hall. When my girlfriend asked Mrs. Harding if she needed help, Mrs. Harding just smiled, pushed Val aside, and walked into Mr. Willie's room. Mrs. Harding stood next to his bed and placed her hand on his foot. Mr. Willie opened his eyes and looked at her. They gave one another a smile. Then Mrs. Harding started softly humming a song. After a moment, Mr. Willie joined in and began to hum alongside her. My girlfriend said she cried her eyes out. A minute later, a nurse came walking by the open door. The nurse consoled Mrs. Harding and led her back to her own room. Mr. Willie quickly went back to sleep, but Val said she couldn't any longer. She stayed up the rest of the night. When she was ready to leave out for work the next morning, she kissed her grandfather's hand as she always did. This time he woke up. He looked at her, smiled, and began struggling to speak. Tell her, thank you. It was the first time Mr. Willie said anything in months. And then just that fast, he was asleep again. When Val left her job that afternoon, she stopped at a store to buy one of those decoratively arranged fruit baskets. She wanted to thank Mrs. Harding for whatever she had done the night prior. When my girlfriend arrived at the facility, Mrs. Harding's family was visiting with her. Val spent a few moments recalling to them what had taken place and what Mrs. Harding had done. Mrs. Harding looked at Val like she was crazy. I did no such thing, she exclaimed. My girlfriend left the fruit basket and expressed her appreciation to Mrs. Harding anyway. Then as Val approached her grandfather's room, she could hear voices from beyond his door. She knocked and let herself in. Two of Mr. Willie's sisters were in the room with him, and all three were holding a full conversation. Mr. Willie came home from hospice one final time. He passed away 3 years later, exactly 6 months after Mrs. Harding.